You wake up in a monastery. It's damp, it's gray, and it smells like sheep. Not metaphorically. Literally sheep. Because the monastery owns sheep, and the monks make everything from scratch, including your mattress, which is mostly straw and shame, and your blanket, which is woven from wool and disappointment. It's sometime in the 12th century. But of course you don't know that, because clocks haven't been invented yet, and time is just a vague concept defined by bells, prayers, and how many blisters you get before lunch. Your name is irrelevant. Let's call you Brother Noise. You've taken a vow of silence, which is a great irony, because today you'll be making music. Without instruments. Why? Because you're poor. Or holy. Or both. Instruments are expensive, complicated, and suspiciously pagan. That harp? Too Celtic. That drum? Too tribal. That flute? Too fun. And God doesn't like fun. At least, not in 12th century Europe. So instead, you sing. Now, before you roll your eyes and drift off into blessed slumber, take a second to like this video. Go on, click that thumbs up button like you're tolling a bell for Vespers. And if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, yes, even this absurdly long, sarcastic bedtime tour through musical misery, subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Because nothing says I'm spiritually adrift like tuning into medieval music facts at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Back to you, Brother Noise. You shuffle through the cloister like a sleep-deprived penguin in sandals made from cowhide and consequences. The air is cold, and your robe, the same one you've worn all week, is full of holes. Not in a trendy, modern, I thrifted this kind of way. More of a moths were the least of your problems sort of thing. And now it's time for choir practice. Except there are no instruments. There's no piano to find your pitch, no auto-tune, no Spotify playlist of Gregorian lo-fi beats to chill/pray to. There is only your voice and maybe, if Brother Armand is in a good mood, a tuning fork, which is basically a tiny piece of metal that says A when smacked against a bench. That's as high-tech as things get. So how do you make music in this bleak, instrumentless world? Well, first, you chant. Chanting is the medieval version of elevator music, monotonous, soothing, and designed to suppress all emotion. It's called plain chant because it's plain. Like your breakfast. Which, by the way, was barley porridge again. With maybe a prune, if you were lucky. You weren't lucky. Gregorian chant, the most famous kind, sounds holy and serious and like it belongs in the background of a video game cathedral. But let's not pretend it was glamorous. You and your monk brothers stand in rows, singing in unison, which means no harmony, no rhythm, no flair. Just one long, droning note after another, like a very slow, very pious kazoo made of people. It's not even in English. It's in Latin, which you don't speak. You've memorized the words by pure repetition. You could be singing about soup, or taxes, or geese. You have no idea. There are no musical notes like we know them. Instead, you have neumes. Neumes are medieval squiggles that float above the lyrics like little eyebrow shapes. They're not precise, more like sing higher here or kind of droop down at this part. Reading them is like trying to follow IKEA instructions written by a drunk Roman ghost. And don't think you get to pick your own tune. No improvising. No jazz. Improvisation is for heretics. The melody is set, sacred, and possibly stolen from a much older chant that no one remembers the origin of. Half the time, it's just oral tradition, passed down from brother to brother until someone forgets and makes something up. And then that becomes canon. Congratulations. You've invented medieval remix culture. You sing for hours. Not because you're good, but because that's your job. Also because the monks believe music brings you closer to God. And also because it's too dark to do much else after sunset and your only entertainment options are 1. Copying the Bible by candlelight until your hand cramps, or 2. Learning to chant slightly more melodically about sin. Now, let's talk about polyphony. That's when two or more voices sing at different pitches. You'd think this would be exciting. It's not. It causes chaos. You see, around the 9th century, someone got the bright idea to sing in organum, which means adding a second voice that mimics the first but at a different interval. This was considered edgy. Like, oh no, they're singing in harmony, what's next, dancing? It caused actual debates. Serious ones. Monks argued over whether God wanted polyphony. Because if your voice was already praising him, would a second voice be overkill? What if it was dissonant? What if the devil got into the music? What if it made people enjoy themselves? The horror. But eventually, polyphony caught on. Slowly, very slowly, like mold on monastery cheese. And suddenly, you weren't just droning in unison. Now you were layering notes, building texture, and also opening the door to a whole new kind of religious anxiety. Because here's the thing, when there are multiple voices, someone has to lead. And if Brother Thomas sings shark, that's a theological crisis. Did his soul wander? Is he possessed? Is it pride? Probably. Thomas always thinks he's better than you. So now you rehearse polyphony, which is like Gregorian chant, but harder and more likely to end in a quiet existential breakdown. You still don't have instruments, but you do have guidelines. Composers like Boethius wrote treatises about music theory, except it's all in Latin, uses Greek words, and assumes you understand math. Spoiler, you don't. And remember, no sheet music as you know it. Manuscripts are hand-copied, painstakingly, by monks with terrible posture and worse eyesight. The ink is made from oak galls, which are basically wasp spit and tree tumors. You dip your quill, scratch your notes onto parchment made of dead animals, and pray to God you don't make a mistake. Because parchment is expensive, and erasing ink involves scraping it off with a knife. Medieval WordPad had no undo button. If you're lucky, you might get a little red or blue ink for decoration. Maybe even a gold leaf initial if the abbot is feeling fancy. But mostly it's just you, a candle, and the creeping sense that you've accidentally written Holy Virgin Lamb of God instead of God. And now we must address the elephant in the cloister. Not all music was monastic. Some of it came from the outside. I know. Scandalous. Beyond the walls of your sacred stone bunker lies the world of secular music. Sung by peasants, troubadours, jongleur, people with real names and questionable hygiene. They sing about love, war, drinking, and things the church would rather not name in public. They have songs with verses and choruses, with rhythm, sometimes even dancing. Madness. And here's the kicker, most of these people don't have instruments either. Not proper ones, anyway. A drum might be a stretched animal stomach on a stick. A pipe might be a hollowed-out bone. A fiddle is a stick with strings and ambition. If they're lucky, a noble might own a lute. But for most people, music just means voices, stomping, clapping, and whatever object sounds less awful when hit with another object. Peasant parties sound like this. Someone starts a song. Someone else harmonizes. Someone stomps. Someone claps. Someone else bangs a pot and pretends it's percussion. Someone drinks too much and falls over. You get the idea. It's chaotic. It's beautiful. It's deeply frowned upon by the clergy. And yet, it survives. Because you can't stop people from making music. Even without instruments. Even when life is short, brutal, and mostly mud. Music happens. Around hearth fires. In markets. On the road. In fields. In taverns. In dreams. You, dear brother Noise, may be confined to your abbey. Your vow of silence occasionally lifted just enough to chant about divine mysteries in Aeolian mode. But somewhere beyond the cloister wall, a girl is singing while picking herbs. A shepherd whistles a tune to his flock. A beggar hums a melody no one else remembers. And all of it, instrumentless, echoes through time. Isn't that weirdly comforting? Now take a breath. Your feet hurt. Your robe is itchy. The candle is flickering. Brother Thomas is still off-key. You've been up since before dawn, and you're scheduled to chant again before sunrise. But for now, rest. We're just getting started. You wake up again. You're not sure how much time has passed. Could have been an hour. Could have been 2 centuries. There's no clock, no phone, and the sun is still doing that vague medieval sky bleeding through the window thing. You're not entirely sure if it's morning or late purgatory. You sit up. Your joints creak like an old cathedral door. You stretch. Something pops in your neck. Possibly your soul leaving the building. And then, like the good monk or peasant you are, you return to the most important task of the day, making music. With what? Ah yes. Your body. Your voice. And a deep well of spiritual repression. Because in this era, vocal technique is everything. Why? Because there's nothing else. You can't hide behind a fancy violin solo or a sick drum beat. You are the instrument. A slightly underfed, sleep-deprived, lice-ridden human organ pipe. And what a glorious instrument you are. Mostly nasal, mildly off-key, and prone to coughing fits whenever someone burns too much incense. Now, if you're picturing your medieval self standing in a well-lit rehearsal hall, think again. You're probably in a cold stone chamber, or a church nave, or, if you're a peasant, a dirt patch outside a barn. Your audience consists of 2 chickens, a depressed-looking dog, and your cousin Ethelfrida, who has 1 tooth and an intense stare. Still, you warm up. Sort of. You do some deep breaths. You stretch your face. You mumble a few phrases from the Psalms. You gargle water from a wooden cup that may or may not have had wine in it yesterday. It's fine. Sanitation is a suggestion, not a rule. Now you sing. And here's the secret sauce. Medieval vocal technique was weird. Not bad, just weird. Depending on where and when you were, the expectations for vocal sound could vary wildly. There was no standard pitch. No agreed-upon vowel shapes. No recorded examples. Just a lot of squinting at hand-copied manuscripts and trying not to die of plague. So how did they sing? Let's start with monks. Because let's be honest, if you weren't in a monastery, your chances of doing any formal music were slim to non-existent. As a monk, you were taught to sing clearly, slowly, and with reverence, which is a polite way of saying, try not to sound too joyful. God is listening, and He does not appreciate vocal runs. You focused on pure tones, no vibrato, no melisma, and absolutely no flair. Think slow-motion Latin karaoke in a wind tunnel. If your singing sounded anything like you were enjoying yourself, it was probably sinful. That said, there were techniques. Controlled breathing, smooth phrasing, rounded vowels, and a relentless focus on clarity. You didn't just mumble sacred texts. You enunciated them with the energy of a man who has nothing left to lose except his eternal soul. Then there were the troubadours, the rock stars of medieval France. Sort of. They sang about love, war, longing, and occasionally, hedgehogs. No, really. One troubadour song is about how a hedgehog was falsely accused of eating chic. I'm not making this up. This is what happens when your diet is mostly bread and existential dread. Troubadour singing was less about choral precision and more about storytelling. You wanted to project, to emote, to communicate. So instead of slow, holy drones, you had rhythm, melodic jumps, and even gasp personality. You might sing with a slight nasal quality, partially because of the climate and partially because that's just how things were done, and you often used your natural voice. Whatever that meant. There were no coaches, no microphones, no warm-up app, just you, a cup of mead, and the tragic tale of a woman who fell in love with a knight who died dramatically in a river. Now let's talk about falsetto. Yes, that's a thing, especially in later medieval periods and early Renaissance, when boys' choirs became a fashion, mostly because women weren't allowed to sing in churches. Composers wanted higher voices, so they got them, using children, or men with unusually flexible vocal cords, or, in some places, men who'd been surgically persuaded not to go through puberty. You do not want to think too hard about that last one. Just smile and nod, and try to forget what castrato means. In the earlier medieval period, though, it was all natural range. If you couldn't hit a note, you didn't. That was it. There was no sheet music police. You just stayed in your lane. A very low, very gravelly lane, if you were a shepherd from Saxony with seasonal hay fever. And now, of course, we must address ornamentation, which is a fancy term for doing more than the bare minimum. In the early days, ornamentation was rare, not because people lacked creativity, but because musical culture was terrified of excess. Everything had to be controlled, reverent, and in service of God, or your Lord, or whoever was currently paying you with bread and not stabbing you. But slowly, as polyphony grew, as secular music spread, ornamentation crept in. A little flourish here, a decorative melisma there, a sudden dip in pitch just to show off. Nothing wild, just enough to make the elders nervous. In the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain, vocal music was incredibly ornamented. Arabic influence brought melismatic singing, complex scales, and rich vocal expression. Singers there were trained, formally, intentionally. Some were even professionals. Meanwhile, in England, someone was trying to sing a hymn over the sound of pigs squealing. It's all about context. Let's not forget vocal projection. Medieval architecture was not built for soundproofing. It was built to make you feel small, cold, and spiritually inadequate. So singers learned to project. Not shout, not bark, but resonate. You used your chest voice, your head voice, and whatever part of your soul hadn't given up yet. Echoes were your backup singers. The church walls were your amplifier. And the pigeons in the rafters were your most loyal audience. Now imagine you're a peasant, not a monk. You've just finished digging trenches for turnip water or something equally bleak. It's twilight. Your back hurts. But someone starts to sing. A local song. Something rhythmic. Something familiar. You join in. So does your neighbor. Soon, half the village is humming along, badly. No technique. No pitch accuracy. Just raw, communal noise. And that, arguably, was the most honest music of all. But wait. You say, weren't there styles? Yes, there were styles. Conductus, a type of Latin song sung in unison, often with a clear, marching rhythm. It was like Gregorian chant's more confident cousin. Still sacred, but with swagger. Motet, polyphonic. Complex. Confusing. Imagine singing one text while your friend sings a different one, in another language, and somehow it's supposed to sound good. Welcome to the medieval motet. It's like vocal multitasking for theology majors. Cantigas, in Spain and Portugal, these were narrative songs in vernacular language. You didn't need to know Latin. You just needed to feel the story. Often dedicated to the Virgin Mary, sometimes about miracles, occasionally about someone falling down a well. Laudi, popular in Italy. These were spiritual songs for lay people. Catchy. Easy to remember. Think church-approved earworms. And all of this? Vocal. Voice only. Maybe a bell. Maybe someone clapping. But mostly, just throats and bravery. It's strange, isn't it? In a world with no technology, no headphones, no reverb pedals or looper stations, music still happened. Because humans can't shut up. Not even when they should. We sing when we're sad. When we're bored. When we're hoping for rain. When we're marching to war. When we're crushing grapes with our feet and want to make it a little less disgusting. Voice was the original instrument. And the only one guaranteed to follow you around, even when you're barefoot in the mud and running from Vikings. So breathe in. Slowly. Like a monk about to chant the opening of Matins. Feel your chest expand. Feel the silence. Then let out a long, even note. You don't have to be good. No one is listening. Except maybe Brother Thomas again, who is, as always, slightly flat. And with that, sleep comes. You wake up again. Except this time, you're already awake. Sort of. You never really slept. You just laid there in your itchy straw bed, listening to the sounds of a rat chewing on a hue. Maybe your shoe. Maybe not. Ownership is a loose concept in the 12th century. The fire's gone out. Your breath fogs in the cold morning air. And somewhere, across the dirt courtyard of your uncomfortably communal life, someone is clapping. Not politely. Not like, oh bravo, Sir Cedric, wonderful lute solo. No. This is raw, percussive, rhythmic clapping. The kind that tells you someone either just finished a dance or is about to summon demons. Clapping in the medieval world was complicated. Like your relationship with your goat. Or the local friar's views on bathing. It was a body-made sound, and as such, it walked a fine line between natural and suspiciously joyful. Because let's get one thing clear. In many early religious settings, rhythm was seen as morally questionable. Anything that made people want to tap their foot, bob their head, or, God forbid, move their hips, was flirting dangerously with the devil. Music should uplift the soul, not the buttocks. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's back up. Back to the basics. You don't have instruments. You're poor. You're bored. And you've had the same dinner for 17 days, barley mush with a side of stop complaining. At least it's not raw turnips. So what do? You clap. You stomp. You slap your thighs. You snap your fingers. Or rather, you try to snap your fingers. But centuries of calluses and freezing wind have turned your hands into medieval oven mitts. Still, you try. Welcome to the glorious, toe-tapping, bishop-annoying world of body percussion. Let's talk clapping first. Clapping was one of the most universal ways of making music without, having music. It was rhythm, it was emphasis, it was entertainment, and sometimes it was just the only way you could get your kids to pay attention during a ballad about someone who died horribly. But clapping wasn't always just clapping. Sometimes it became codified, structured, ritualized. In medieval Spain and parts of North Africa, for instance, rhythmic hand clapping accompanied songs, chants, and dances. Flamenco, centuries later, would draw from these same roots, blending Islamic, Jewish, and Christian traditions into an aggressively percussive art form that was basically one long theological argument in musical form. But back in the earlier Middle Ages, clapping had rules, or at least expectations. In religious settings, it was rare. Too much fun. The church fathers were constantly worried that anything rhythmically satisfying might cause spontaneous heresy. After all, wasn't Lucifer the angel of music? Why give him a beat drop? Still, some brave souls clapped during processions, or after successful battles, or when a relic didn't explode. Context was everything. In the secular world, however, in villages, markets, weddings, and those deeply awkward tavern dances where no one really knows where to put their hands, clapping was king. You clapped to keep the beat. You clapped to follow the chant. You clapped because you were too poor to own bells and too smart to hit a drum in front of the wrong bishop. And then there's stomping. Oh, stomping. The most basic form of percussion. You don't need talent. You don't need rhythm. You just need feet, floor, and mild to moderate frustration with your living situation. You stomp during dances. You stomp to signal transitions. You stomp because the fire won't start and your spouse just accused you of being possessed again. And when paired with clapping, you've basically invented a rave. A very slow, itchy, medieval rave that smells like goat in despair. In fact, in some traditions, especially in the Balkans, parts of Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean, percussive dance developed into a legitimate musical form. The feet became the instrument. And if you did it right, you could build entire rhythmic structures just by moving your body across the dirt like a very determined tambourine. Which brings us to a related and highly underrated art, thigh slapping. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. You slap your own legs, rhythmically, and hopefully with enough padding to avoid bruising. Slapping was used in folk dances, rhythmic chants, and, if we're honest, probably just to stay warm. It was percussion, self-defense, and cardio all rolled into one. And when your thighs were tired, you slapped your chest, or your arms, or whatever body part still had feeling in it. Some cultures developed entire slap dances. Think of it like proto-body drum routines. In Bavaria, centuries later, Schupplatler dancers would spin, slap their shoes and knees, and leap into the air like caffeinated woodcutters. But even in the medieval period, early versions of these dances existed. They were usually regional, often performed at weddings, and occasionally ended with someone falling into a fire. You might be wondering, did the church approve of any of this? No. Well, sometimes. It depended. See, church officials were deeply suspicious of anything that looked fun, especially if peasants were doing it. Peasants were meant to suffer nobly, not develop sick dance moves. But in places like southern France or northern Italy, body percussion occasionally slipped into religious festivals. Not the high holy services, of course, but the public processions, the open-air feasts, the bits where saints were paraded through the streets and someone inevitably dropped a relic. You might even see monks clapping, hesitantly, like they were trying not to wake God. And if you were lucky, truly lucky, someone might even start a circle dance. Known as a carol in Old French, this was a simple group dance involving singing and, you guessed it, clapping in rhythm. It was repetitive, melodic, and socially acceptable unless someone broke out into secular lyrics about kissing in the hay barn, at which point the priest would hurl a loaf of bread at your head and cancel the dance. And what about rhythm? Without instruments, you became the metronome. Clapping wasn't just decoration. It was structure. You kept the beat for songs with complex melodies, for chants that needed a clear pulse, for dances where the only thing keeping your limbs coordinated was the sound of your own increasingly raw palms. And if you got it wrong, it didn't matter, because medieval music was gloriously imprecise. There was no conductor, no time signature, no angry mun in a black turtleneck yelling "You're rushing" from the corner of the abbey. You just kept going, clapped until your hands tingled, stomped until the dust rose, slapped your thigh like it owed you money, and hoped the rhythm gods or Saint Cecilia or your half-drunk neighbor Jeff would carry you through. Let's not forget, rhythm was memory. If you couldn't read, and most people couldn't, rhythm helped you remember lyrics, steps, and verses. Think of it like a medieval mnemonic device, only louder, and with a higher chance of shin splints. So, next time you find yourself without Spotify, without instruments, without hope, just remember, you are a walking percussion section. You are rhythm incarnate. You are a peasant with surprisingly good timing and nothing to lose. And as you lay back down, under your damp wool blanket that smells faintly of cabbage and regret, you hear it, faint, through the cracked shutter. Someone is clapping. Not well, but with feeling. Maybe it's a festival. Maybe a birth. Maybe someone just successfully herded 3 goats into a pen without dying. Doesn't matter. It's music. And it's made without instruments. Just hands and feet, and the raw, unstoppable urge to make noise in a world that tries very hard to silence you. Sleep now. Dream of stomping monks. Of peasants slapping their legs in perfect unison. Of bishops sweating nervously every time someone claps offbeat. And when you wake, we'll move on to the next scandalous development. Chant battles, competitive psalm singing, and how medieval people weaponized harmony before it was cool. You wake up in a cloister. Not because you chose this life, but because someone thought you looked suspiciously musical as a child and sent you to the monastery for safekeeping. It's the 11th century. Your parents have 12 other children and 3 functional spoons. You're the expendable one. The room is cold. Always cold. It smells like beeswax, moldy parchment, and the collective disappointment of men who have sworn to be celibate but are constantly thinking about cheese. Today is a big day. You're chanting. Again. But not just any chanting. Oh no. Today is the feast of Saint Wuborida, patron saint of people who made wildly specific life choices. And the abbot has decreed that all 4 monastic houses in the region will perform a chant face-off. Yes, that's real. Welcome to the cutthroat world of medieval chant battles, where pious men and women try to outsing each other in the name of God, but also out of sheer, simmering pettiness. Before we dive in, take a moment to gently nudge your thumbs toward that like button and maybe subscribe, if you enjoy your historical suffering served with sarcasm and candlelight. And let me know in the comments what time you're tuning in, and from where. I want to know who else is up at 2:37 a.m. listening to monks passive-aggressively harmonize. Okay, let's get to it. So, medieval Europe. The church runs basically everything except the pigs and the weather. And music? That belongs to the monks, the nuns, the chanters, the sleep-deprived scribes copying hymnals by candlelight with fingers so stiff they could be used as tuning forks. But here's the twist. Music, in this world, isn't just sound. It's scripture. It's memory. It's power. And it's all happening without instruments. No lyres. No fiddles. No trumpets unless you're a cathedral or the Pope himself is popping by to criticize your Benedictine beat. So how do you make music in this pious, echo-filled world? You chant. Endlessly. Painstakingly. With a kind of emotional restraint that makes Gregorian monks sound like they're being held at sword point by solemnity itself. Let's talk about that. Chanting in the Middle Ages wasn't just singing without instruments. It was a discipline, a full-body spiritual posture, like yoga, but in Latin and with more emotional repression. And it came in flavors. The most famous was Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, who definitely didn't invent it, but got the naming rights like some medieval version of Steve Jobs. Gregorian chant is what you think of when you picture 30 monks in black robes droning in low, unified tones inside a cold stone cathedral, while one of them tries not to sneeze during the Sanctus. Gregorian chant is monophonic, which means everybody sings the same melody at the same time. No harmony, no surprise chords, just beautiful, floating solemnity that never goes anywhere, like musical incense. But this was just the beginning. You see, as monks chanted daily, in the divine office, in mass, in funerals, weddings, plagues, and post-plague weddings, they began to compete. Not overtly, of course. That would be sinful. but also very human. Enter the glorious world of chant dialects. Every monastery thought their version of a chant was the right one. Benedictines in Burgundy would chant a little faster. Cistercians in France liked long pauses, because who doesn't love suspense before saying Amen? Meanwhile, in Italy, monks were doing flourishes like "oh, oh, oh," as if Mariah Carey had taken a vow of silence. In Spain, we had Mozarabic chant. In Milan, it was Ambrosian chant. In the Gallican churches of what is now France, they had Gallican chant, which sounds suspiciously like we heard what Rome was doing and decided we could do it weirder. These regional chant dialects were kind of like medieval jazz scenes. Each one had its quirks. One group would elongate vowels, another would throw in unexpected tonal shifts, and occasionally someone would invent a completely unnecessary new syllable for Kyrie. Now, here's where it gets spicy, or, well, spicy by monk standards. Sometimes, monasteries would meet up, and when they did, each group would insist on using their own chant. It became an unspoken competition. Not a battle of the bands exactly, more of a battle of the slightly slower syllables. They'd gather in a cloister. One group would begin with a plain song, the others would join in, sort of, trying not to show off but absolutely showing off. One monk would hold a note slightly longer. Another would intone with just a little too much flair. It was like musical chess, with incense. These weren't spontaneous jam sessions. They were deeply rehearsed. You'd have trained for this your whole life if you can call learning to chant the complete Psalter while also avoiding heresy training. And since no instruments were allowed, especially during Lent or on somber feast days or when someone important had recently died, your voice was the orchestra. The body became the instrument. You controlled breath, pitch, phrasing, and enunciation with the kind of detail normally reserved for tax audits. Now, let's imagine you're in this cloister. You've been assigned the opening antiphon. Your palms are sweating. Not because of nerves. You haven't felt those since the oat famine of 1093, but because you're wrapped in wool and the sun is hitting you like divine punishment. You take a deep breath. Ora pro nobis. The other monks murmur approvingly. One of them twitches. Another silently blesses himself. You nailed it. Probably. But wait, here come the Cluniacs. Cluniac monks were like the drama kids of the monastic world. Ornate, precise, devoted to beauty, detail, and the subtle art of making your chant sound just a little holier than everyone else's. They enter the cloister like they've been waiting for this all year. Their leader raises a hand. The chant begins. It's rich. It's full. It's suspiciously harmonic. Yes, harmony. The scandal of the century. See, around the 9th century, some brave, or possibly possessed, monk in the Frankish kingdom said, "What if we sang 2 notes at once?" This became the foundation of organum, the early form of polyphony. And it made traditionalists clutch their relics in horror. Because polyphony meant multiple voices. And that, in the eyes of purists, sounded dangerously like joy. But harmony caught on. Slowly. In elite cathedrals. In secret manuscripts. Eventually, by the 12th century, monks were composing Notre Dame polyphony, a rich, layered form of sacred music that made you feel like your soul was being gently slow-roasted in a stained glass oven. All without instruments, just lungs, and training, and the occasional divine vision. So there you are, listening to rival monks chant with suspicious flair. You try not to feel competitive. You try to focus on the Latin. You accidentally start harmonizing just a third above. No one notices, or they pretend not to, because it's a chant battle and rules are fluid. By the end of the day, no one declares a winner. That would be unholy. But everyone knows who crushed it. Brother Alwyn, with his angelic phrasing and suspiciously steady vibrato. You suspect he's been practicing in the crypt again. As the sun sets, the cloister quiets. The chants dissolve into prayer. And you finally exhale. Your ears are ringing with the sound of voices. Just voices. Rising. Falling. Layering in slow, sacred beauty. 1,000 years before radio. Before Spotify. Before that guy with the ukulele ruined the subway commute. This is how people made music, without instruments. With rivalry. With ritual. With vocal cords and endless hours of practice and the occasional holy passive aggression. So you go to bed in your cold stone cell, dreaming of chant dialects and secret polyphony, and whether it's a sin to want to outshine Brother Alwyn. Next time, we'll travel away from the monasteries and into the towns, where merchants, beggars, and drama queens of all stripes discover the power of storytelling through song. Ballads, broadsides, and public performances, the medieval mixtape, made entirely by memory and mouth. You wake up to shouting. Not Latin prayer chanting. No, this is shouting in Middle English, or Old French, or Low German, depending on which half-functioning kingdom you're pretending to survive in today. You're not in a monastery anymore. You've been cast out, or maybe you escaped, and now you're in town. A proper medieval town. With rats, loud merchants, suspicious puddles, and roughly one bath per capita every never. You lie on your straw mattress, which smells like mildew and bad decisions. The sun is bleeding through your wooden shutters, if you're lucky enough to have them, and someone outside is already playing the instrument of the people, their voice. No, it's not a religious chant this time. It's a ballad. And it's catchy. So before we follow the wandering singer shouting about betrayal, ghosts, or inexplicably erotic vegetables, take a second to do the medieval equivalent of lighting a devotional candle for the algorithm. Like this video. Subscribe if you enjoy your historical misery slow-cooked, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you in bed? On a walk? Trapped in a 14th century tannery with no deodorant and a lute you can't afford? I want to know. Okay. So you shuffle outside, stepping over a pig in someone's shoe. In front of the alehouse is a man with a tattered cloak, a missing tooth, and a crowd of at least 11 vaguely curious townspeople. He's singing. Loudly. With dramatic facial expressions. He might have a drum or a string instrument, sure, but more likely, he's got nothing but a voice, a memory, and possibly lice. This is your local balladeer. And he's your Spotify Discover Weekly, if Spotify were loud, human, and slightly drunk before noon. Ballads were the medieval world's version of viral content. Shortish songs, usually with a strong narrative hook, love, betrayal, murder, revenge, death by pastry, someone sleeping with their sister, the usual. Delivered in catchy, repetitive melodies, so simple even a bored shepherd could remember them. And most importantly, you didn't need instruments. In fact, most people couldn't afford them. Instruments cost money. Voices were free. So you sang. You memorized the story, passed it on, twisted it a little, made it your own, and suddenly, you were the medieval equivalent of a cover artist with a Patreon. In the towns, music without instruments came from people who had no choice. You sang while you worked. Washing clothes? Sing. Tanning hides? Sing. Making 400 identical loaves of bread for people who think seasoning is heresy? Sing louder. Some of this music was functional. Songs to keep rhythm, pass time, or drown out your own despair. Others were more like oral newspapers. Songs that carried news, real or otherwise, from one town to the next. Remember, no printing press yet. No reliable mail. Your choices were learn it by ear or die ignorant. Let's talk about the structure of these songs. Most medieval ballads, especially the popular ones, were strophic. That means the same melody repeated over and over, with new lyrics in each verse. Why? Because people needed it to be memorized. Music had to live in your body, not on paper. And paper, by the way, was stupidly expensive. You might as well wipe your medieval but with gold leaf. So ballads used rhyme, repetition, and vivid imagery to help the memory stick. And they were passed mouth to mouth. No, not like that. I mean verbally. And orally. But not orally like, never mind. You get it. A popular example? Try Lord Randall. The lyrics go something like, "Oh, where ha' you been, Lord Randall, my son? And where ha' you been, my handsome young man? I ha' been at the greenwood, mother, make my bed soon, for I'm weary why hunting, and fain wold lie down." Spoiler alert, Lord Randall is poisoned and dies by the end. Medieval audiences love that. Nothing says entertainment like a young noble coughing out his final verse while his mother weeps in melodic triplets. But not all songs were tragic. Many were raunchy, satirical, or downright stupid. And I mean that with love. There's one Middle English lyric that reads, "I have a young sister far beyond the sea. She can bake a cherry pie, quick as you can blink an eye." Sounds innocent. Except it's not. The whole thing is loaded with sexual innuendo. Cherry pies were not about pastry. Welcome to medieval humor, subtle, cheeky, and always 3 steps away from getting you excommunicated. Now imagine you're in a tavern. You've had 3 cups of wine that tastes like regret. Someone breaks into song. Everyone joins in. Not because it's rehearsed, but because they know it. It's been sung across villages, across years, passed from one generation to the next by sheer repetition. This is how music moved in the medieval world. Not through notation, but through human memory. Like a virus. A beautiful, catchy virus that can rhyme love with shove and still make grown men weak. You're humming along now. You don't even realize it. The tune has lodged itself in your brain like a splinter of joy. Tomorrow, you'll sing it while hauling sacks of barley, or while watching your cousin try to seduce the reeve again. The beauty of it? Everyone's version is different. No song exists in just one form. There are hundreds of versions of the same ballads, with swap verses, regional tweaks, new endings, alternate deaths. It's the medieval equivalent of fan fiction. And it never stops evolving. And yes, sometimes, songs got political. When kings did something stupid, which, statistically, was about 3 times a week, balladeers would slip critical lyrics into their tunes. The king eats too well, they'd sing. Or his taxes smell of fish. Something appropriately biting. And if the wrong official heard it, you were thrown in the stocks. Or worse, recruited into the army. So ballads weren't just fun. They were resistance. They were commentary. They were community memory wrapped in melody. And they could be performed anywhere, with nothing but a voice. You could sing them in a field, at a wedding, at a hanging. Yes, really. Executions were public events, and someone always sang. Sometimes to mock the condemned. Sometimes to mourn. Sometimes to remind everyone else not to mess with the sheriff. And if you weren't into ballads, maybe you'd try story songs, like the chansons de geste in France, which told heroic tales of knights doing very heroic things like ignoring their wives, killing Saracens, and dying gloriously on hillsides. Always a crowd favorite. But let's not forget the women. Women sang too. Oh, they sang. At home. In the fields. While weaving. While grieving. Female voices carried lullabies, laments, work songs, and gossip ballads that told you who slept with whom and what the priest did behind the apse last week. Many of these songs didn't survive, not because they weren't good, but because history, as usual, decided to hit delete on women's voices. Still, echoes remain. In scraps of lyrics. In nursery rhymes. In folk tunes that made their way across oceans and into later cultures. These songs were kept alive not by lords and bishops, but by grandmothers, midwives, widows, and that one neighbor who definitely knows too much. And here's the kicker, none of this needed instruments. People had voices. And more importantly, they had stories, rhythms, moods. You didn't need a harp to feel heartbreak. You just needed a singer. A human being with lungs and pain and a sense of melody passed down like a family secret. As you shuffle back to your little hovel, the ballad still playing in your head, you realize this is how people made music. Not with lutes or flutes or courtly ensembles, but with mouths, memories, and the occasional curse word hidden under a clever rhyme. Tomorrow, the balladeer might be gone. But the song? It'll still be here. In your neighbor's voice. In your own voice. In the rhythm of your footsteps on the cobbled street. Music, in the Middle Ages, was never just performance. It was survival, expression. A kind of magic you carried in your chest. And you didn't need an instrument to summon it. You wake up in a small, echoing stone room that somehow manages to be both freezing and humid. Congratulations. You're now a choir novice. You didn't choose this. Someone, your parents, a lord, fate, or a midlife crisis in the year 1263, decided that your voice might be slightly less terrible than average, and that's good enough to be drafted into the glamorous, backbreaking world of liturgical singing. You own no instruments. You have no sheet music. You barely have shoes. But you're expected to perform divine, celestial music every morning at ungodly hours, and somehow stay in tune. Don't worry. You'll be trained. In ways that range from mildly confusing to possibly invented by sleep-deprived angels. But first, before we start warming up your medieval lungs, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy weird, sarcastic deep dives into historical suffering. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Bonus points if you're actually falling asleep to this. Extra bonus points if you're doing Gregorian chant in your dreams. All right, back to your strange new reality. You shuffle in line with 12 other boys who look like they haven't seen daylight since Advent. Your choir master, a man with zero chill and the posture of a vulture in a robe, gives you no instruments, no pitch pipe, no friendly hello. Just a sharp look and an expectation that you will, somehow, hear with your soul. Because today, children, we're learning to sing using only hand signs and invisible notes. Welcome to the medieval system of psalmization, the ancient method of teaching musical pitch using syllables and hand gestures, and quite possibly the first ever music education method created by a man with zero access to Spotify, TikTok, or patience. Enter Guido of Arezzo. No, not a barista. He was a medieval monk and music theorist, kind of like the Steve Jobs of prenotation music theory, minus the turtleneck. Around the year 1025, he introduced a system called the hexachord, 6 notes, each with a specific name: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Yes. Oot, not do. Oot, like the sound you make when you step on a rake barefoot. This 6-note system was based on a scale that started on C, went up to A, and then had to do some mental gymnastics to explain why it didn't quite reach a full octave. Guido didn't care. He was too busy revolutionizing music education using the most advanced tool of the time, your hand. This brings us to the Guidonian hand. Let's paint a picture. You, a nervous choir boy with a voice like a damp candle, are standing in front of a monk. He lifts his hand, palm out, finger splayed. He then proceeds to point at specific joints, knuckles, and fingertips, each representing a different pitch. It's like a medieval karaoke machine projected onto human anatomy. Want to know where mi is? It's on the middle joint of your index finger. Fa. That's on the edge of your ring finger. La. Creep toward the top of your pinky. You don't need a harp. You need a hand. Just one. Preferably a clean one, but hygiene standards were optional. So now, as a student, you're taught to look at the monk's hand, not to read sheet music, but to follow pitches like you're reading some arcane musical palmistry. It's part mnemonic device, part auditory map, part weird interpretive dance. But it worked. Sort of. At least until someone sneezed mid-gesture and the entire choir hit the wrong note. To be fair, it was genius. Guido was trying to solve a very real problem. How do you teach accurate pitch without instruments, books, or reliable literacy? Answer: you project the scale onto your meat suit. The human body becomes the blackboard. The hand becomes the piano. The choir becomes, still slightly off-key, but slightly less so. But how did singers hear the first pitch to begin with? Great question, imaginary student. Sometimes, they used a monochord, a single-stringed instrument used just to demonstrate intervals. One string. One movable bridge. You'd pluck it, adjust the bridge, explain half steps and whole steps, then go right back to singing with nothing but your lungs and the haunting fear of screwing up in front of God. But more often than not, there was no instrument at all. The pitch was set by someone with a good ear. The leader, often the oldest, least amused monk, would simply belt out the first note, and you prayed it wasn't too high. If it was, enjoy watching half the choir wheeze their way through the service like panic birds. Now, let's talk about rhythm. Ah yes, rhythm, the one thing medieval notation barely bothered to explain. You're standing in a line, holding a manuscript that looks like it was drawn by a half-blind goat with a feather quill. The notes, called neumes, look like tiny scribbles, hovering above the text. But there's no time signature. No clear beats. Just vibes. Sacred, terrifying, rhythmically ambiguous vibes. So how did you know how long to hold a note? Answer: you didn't. You guessed. You followed the leader. You mimicked what you heard. If you were off, well, you probably weren't the only one. Think of it like singing Happy Birthday at a restaurant. No two people are on the same beat. Everyone kind of fumbles along, hoping it ends on the right note. Now imagine doing that in Latin, at 6 a.m., while fasting. Some monks eventually developed modal rhythms, repeating patterns of long and short notes based on poetry and phrasing. But for most people in most places, it was oral tradition. You sang it the way you were taught. By ear. By memory. By sheer repetition. Repetition was everything. You'd rehearse the same chant day after day, week after week. Not because you loved it, but because there was no other way to master it. No audio recordings. No YouTube tutorials. No metronome. Just time, patience, and a choir master who looked like he'd bite you if you missed the Gloria. And while we're here, let's talk about punishment. Oh yes, singing badly was not just embarrassing. It could be sinful, especially in sacred settings. If you messed up the Latin, it wasn't just a mistake, it was heresy light. The devil, they said, loved dissonance. So if you hit the wrong note, well, enjoy your extra penance and the deep spiritual shame of being told your voice leads souls astray. Which is ironic, because medieval choirs were often terrible. Out of tune, uneven, offbeat. Half the choir would be prepubescent boys whose voices cracked like firewood in winter. The other half were elderly monks whose lungs had all the power of a wet leather pouch. But when they got it right, it was haunting, ethereal, like 1,000 prayers floating up in harmonized suffering. And somehow, miraculously, they made music. With no instruments. No electric keyboard hidden behind the altar. Just hand signs, voices, memory, and the kind of blind faith only the rhythmically desperate can understand. But the Guidonian hand wasn't just a gimmick. It laid the foundation for solfège, the system we still use today, do, re, mi, etc. It was a bridge between body and sound. It made music embodied, physical, repeatable, human. You didn't need a lyre. You didn't need a harp. You needed a hand, a teacher, a song burned into your skull through endless repetition. And, ideally, a God who was too busy to notice when you accidentally skipped the amen. As night falls and your voice cracks one final time on a painfully high law, you trudge back to your cot. You don't own an instrument. You don't know what a piano is. But you're part of a living tradition that passes music like fire, from mouth to mouth, from hand to heart, from silence to song. And somehow, that's enough. Next chapter, we'll descend into the dirty, glorious world of folk festivals, seasonal celebrations, and pagan holdovers, all those places where music, booze, and dancing collided in the muddiest, noisiest corners of medieval life. Spoiler, it's less pious, more chaotic. You wake up hungover in a damp field. There is hay in your mouth, a goose pecking your ankle, and the faint sound of someone shouting about ale prices in the distance. You are wearing someone else's shoes. Or, more likely, just one shoe. Congratulations. You've just survived the Feast of St. Dunstan, or maybe it was midsummer or the annual pagan remnant that the church pretends isn't happening. Either way, last night was a festival. Which means you, a humble medieval peasant, have officially participated in the rawest, loudest, sweatiest, and most musically bizarre event of the local calendar. And you did it without a single instrument. Because, much like sobriety and dental care, instruments were optional at these things. Here's the thing they don't always tell you in the polite history books. The medieval world wasn't just Gregorian chants and elegant lutes. It was also singing in taverns, rhythmic yelling during sheep shearing, and beating a pot with a stick because your friend got married and this is apparently tradition now. Music was everywhere. It was how you remembered stories, how you warded off boredom, and how you cope with the fact that life involved a shocking number of turnips and very few antibiotics. And the best part? You didn't need real instruments. You had bones, sticks, voices, feet, and an unquenchable thirst for mildly off-key fun. So before we dive headfirst into this public display of rhythmic chaos, do the modern thing and like the video if you're still awake or if you're peacefully drooling, either counts. Subscribe if you want more sarcastic bedtime history. And tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and whether you're listening in a real bed or something that squeaks ominously. Now, back to the hay and the yelling. Let's talk about the noisy genius of peasants. You see, while the aristocrats were busy commissioning expensive harps and hiring court musicians named things like Eustace the Dulcet, regular folks were out in the village square doing the medieval equivalent of freestyle rap battles, only in long tunics and with the occasional cow walking through. Folk music, at its core, was about storytelling. You didn't sing to show off. You sang to remember. Events, battles, tragedies, curses, weddings, murders, all passed down through oral tradition, wrapped up in verses with rhythm and rhyme, because that's how human brains remember things when no one can read. And you didn't need a drum kit. You needed a barrel, a rock, and the raw confidence of someone who's had 2 horns of cider and 0 musical training. Now imagine a field full of peasants. Someone starts to clap. Someone else bangs a stick against a fence post. A third person, possibly named Alfric, definitely missing a tooth, starts stomping in a pattern that may or may not be deliberate. And suddenly, you have percussion. Not good percussion, but it's working. Then comes the vocals. One person starts a call. Others respond with the answer. You've invented the call and response form entirely by accident. It works beautifully for singing during harvest, since it keeps everyone moving in rhythm and prevents you from accidentally threshing your own ankle. Call, ho, lads, swing the scythe. Response, don't cut thy wife. Congratulations. You've just invented a folkwork song. Now, sometimes the songs were more poetic. These were the ballads, narrative songs passed from generation to generation, often featuring love, betrayal, accidental incest, witchcraft, or all of the above. These were sung slowly, dramatically, with repetition built in so that even the drunk guy in the corner could join in on the chorus. Ballads were the Netflix of the illiterate world, bingeable, emotional, and usually longer than they needed to be. The Ballad of Lord Randall, for example, features a man dying of poison stew over the course of 8 repetitive verses. Spoiler, he really should have skipped dinner. And then there were the festival songs, loud, rhythmic, joyful, or at least pretending to be joyful. These were often tied to the liturgical calendar, though whether they were pagan in disguise or actually approved by the church is muddy. Much like the ground you're dancing on. Let's talk mumming. Yes, mumming. It sounds like a sleep disorder. It's not. It's a traditional form of costume performance, often involving masked villagers acting out semi-improvised plays in rhyme. You might be playing St. George. You might be the Turkish knight. You might just be the guy banging a pan in the background. Everyone sings, everyone moves, and no one knows what's happening. But it doesn't matter. Because it's music. Not orchestrated, not written down, but community-powered chaos. Then there's wassailing, a practice that started as a blessing for apple trees and quickly evolved into the medieval version of Christmas caroling, only with more drunkenness and fewer matching sweaters. You'd go door to door, sing rowdy songs, demand food and drink, and threaten vague curses if they didn't give you any. It's like Halloween, but louder and less polite. Your voice cracks? Doesn't matter. You don't know the words? Make them up. Someone joins in with spoons and starts clacking them together like an ancient castanet? Excellent. That's percussion now. And if you think this was all just drunken fun, think again. This was serious tradition. These songs and rhythms marked the seasons. They told you when to sow, when to harvest, when to mourn, and when to get delightfully drunk under the full moon. Even animals got involved. No, really. There's a medieval Welsh tradition called Mari Lwyd, where villagers would parade around a horse skull on a stick draped in a white cloth and challenge households to improvised rhyming battles at their doors. You, inside, tired, just trying to eat soup. Them, outside, with a literal horse skull, demanding a lyrical duel. And the music? Completely a cappella. Just chanting, rhyming, clapping, and the haunting sound of bone against doorframe. Terrifying? Yes. Musical? Also yes. Let's not forget children's songs. These were catchy, repetitive, and often horrifying. Think plague rhymes, riddles about death, lullabies that casually mention wolves eating babies. If you ever wondered what passed for children's entertainment in the 14th century, it was basically Ring Around the Rosie sung by kids who'd seen too much. And again, no instruments. Just voices. Sometimes high-pitched and wobbly. Sometimes booming and off-key. Always communal. The line between musician and audience didn't exist. If you were present, you participated. If you didn't, people assumed you were cursed or French. Now, of course, some peasants did occasionally use rudimentary instruments, crude flutes, whistles, drums made from animal hide and repurposed buckets, but they were rare, expensive, hard to repair. And besides, why carry a harp when you could just clap your hands and yell and pitch? Let's pause and consider a real example. There's a surviving medieval English carol called Sumer is a Cumin in. Yes, that's how it's spelled. You've already lost 5 IQ points trying to read it. It's basically the medieval version of a summer bop. It celebrates the arrival of warm weather, the return of birds, and the deeply unsettling fact that goats are mating again. The lyrics include the phrase "buck you ert," which means the buck farts. So, to recap, you're barefoot, drunk on mead, standing in a field, clapping to the rhythm of goat farts. This is your musical heritage. No piano, no guitar, just the pure, sweaty joy of collective noise-making. Because at the end of the day, music was never about perfect pitch or polished performance. It was about survival, community, expression, catharsis, making sense of the world, or at least making it loud enough to drown out the sadness. You fall asleep tonight with the echo of stomping feet, clacking spoons, and a half-remembered chorus about a blacksmith's daughter who ran off with the miller. Or maybe it was a pig. You're not sure. The lyrics changed halfway through. Tomorrow, it'll happen again. A voice, a rhythm, a foot on packed dirt. The miracle of music, born not in the halls of nobility, but in the dust and sweat of everyday life. When you're ready, we'll venture into the monastic world of illuminated manuscripts and painstakingly hand-copied music, where every note took 6 hours and at least one minor hand injury. You wake up before sunrise. Because of course you do. The church bell has been ringing since just after the last one stopped, a kind of spiritual alarm clock from hell that signals it's time for matins. Or lauds. Or whichever one means get out of your straw-filled mattress and come chant in a cold room. You are a monk now. You gave up possessions, freedom, questionable mutton pies, and quite possibly your birth name to live in a monastery, where the air is cold, the silence is strict, and the musical entertainment is mostly humming in Latin. Welcome to the sacred, and somehow still sleep-deprived, world of monastic music-making. It's 5 a.m. Your sandals are stiff with frost, your robe smells like damp wool and sanctity, and your breakfast, if you're lucky, is bread that's seen better centuries. But there is one luxury here. One single shining point of pride in your otherwise silent, beige life. Music. Not the jolly kind. Not the sort with fiddles and fart jokes. No. This is sacred chant, where every note is measured, deliberate, and designed to summon not joy, but reverence. Or at least a sense of order so intense it might qualify as divine. And today, you've been assigned a truly noble task. No, not shaving the abbot's mule. You get to help copy music. Which sounds romantic, until you realize it involves approximately 6 hours of sitting motionless at a desk, squinting at faded vellum, and trying to decide whether the last note was a clivus or a torquilus, or just a dead fly that got squashed on the page in 1182. Let's back up a bit. In the medieval world, music wasn't read the way it is today. Before about the 9th century, there were no musical staff lines, no time signatures, and certainly no Spotify playlists. Instead, there were neumes, tiny squiggles hovering above the Latin text, giving vague and infuriatingly unhelpful instructions about the shape of the melody, but not the exact pitch or rhythm. It's like someone wrote you directions that say, go uphill, then wobble a bit, then be majestic. Thanks, Brother Alfric. Super clear. Eventually, someone had the genius idea to draw horizontal lines, and then 4 lines because 5 would be too modern, and place the notes on them. This system became known as Gregorian notation, and it slowly spread across monasteries like lice through a novice dormitory. The real heroes of this slow, melodic revolution were the scribe monks. Imagine them, hunched over desks, dipping their goose quills into ink made from oak galls and iron salts, carefully etching notes onto stretched animal skin that crackled every time the room temperature changed. You had to rule every page by hand, draw every note individually, line up every syllable of Latin text to match the precise moment it should be sung. Make one mistake, and you didn't just have to start over. You might have to scrape the entire page clean with a knife, pray for forgiveness, and then spend the next 6 hours fixing it while repressing a deep, quiet scream. But why go to all this trouble? Because monks were obsessed with order. And music, especially plainsong, was considered the purest form of spiritual discipline. The idea was that if everyone chanted the same words, at the same pace, in the same tone, God would be pleased, and possibly stop sending locusts. So every line of chant was carefully organized to match the divine office, a schedule of prayers and psalms sung throughout the day and night. It was like a musical calendar, but one that guaranteed you never got a full night's sleep. And since most monks couldn't afford instruments or were forbidden from using them, The human voice was the only tool allowed. It had to carry every emotion, awe, repentance, humility, and the crushing realization that it's only Tuesday. The music itself? Not catchy, not upbeat, but weirdly hypnotic. It flowed in long, wandering lines, modal, not major or minor, which means it didn't resolve the way modern music does. You never felt closure. Just an ongoing, solemn hover between serenity and very mild unease. Which, now that I say it, is the perfect soundtrack for medieval life. And this was your job now. Sit. Write. Copy music you can't hum at parties. For services you must attend 7 times a day, in a language you understand only slightly more than the average goose. Sometimes, if you're really lucky, the abbot lets you add a little red flourish to the initial letter. You get approximately 4 minutes of joy, followed by another 8 hours of Lord, have mercy in pneumatic notation. Let's talk about the ink. It smells. Everything smells. Ink in monasteries was made from things that would get flagged by modern health inspectors: crushed wasp nests, gallnuts, copper salts, fermented wine. It stained your fingers for weeks and occasionally gave you a mild rash that the apothecary swore wasn't leprosy. Probably. Your fingers? Stiff and ink black. Your back? Bent like an old tree root. Your soul? Somewhere between enlightened and deeply confused. But somehow, the results were beautiful. Monks didn't just copy chant, they illuminated it. Margins filled with gold leaf. Tiny drawings of animals doing vaguely heretical things. Saints floating in blue robes. Every page a devotional act of both faith and mild insanity. And even though you rarely spoke and never danced, you sang. Softly. Every day. The same lines over and over until they became part of your bones. Until the rhythm of chant replaced the rhythm of thought. There's something strangely comforting in that. Sure, the food is boiled beyond recognition, and the guy 2 cells down won't stop muttering about visions of St. Jerome, but at least you know when to chant Te Deum, and that counts for something. Of course, not all monasteries were equally musical. The really big, well-funded ones, like Cluny Abbey in France, had entire choirs, extensive libraries of chant, and enough vellum to wallpaper several cathedrals. But even the smaller monasteries managed a few well-worn chant books, often passed down for centuries, patched, recopied, and sung until the notes faded into nothing. Because that's the thing about medieval music. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It was meant to be lived, sung, heard, felt in the echo of stone walls and the hush of candlelight. No radio, no record player, just human breath and ink-stained parchment. So you chant, again and again, until the prayer bell rings, until the choir master nods, until you forget the world outside even exists. And when you lie down that night on your wooden cot with a pillow made of something that might be moss, you can still hear the lingering echo of your own voice in the vaulted ceiling. It doesn't matter that you didn't have an instrument. You were the instrument. Your lungs, your voice, your carefully trained monotone, a living, breathing part of something larger than yourself. Something ancient, sacred, repetitive to the point of delirium, but peaceful. Very, very peaceful. You wake up to screaming, which, in medieval terms, means you're either in battle or it's Tuesday. Today, it's both. The year is somewhere between before plumbing and after hope, and you are a foot soldier in a vaguely defined war between people who all believe God is on their side. You've slept in a ditch. You smell like wet burlap, desperation, and possibly a duck you stepped on in the dark. There's no armor for you. You're lucky to have shoes. You're holding a spear that's more splendor than weapon, and someone told you this war was about honor, but you suspect it might just be about land and who gets to tax it. You're cold. You're hungry. But then, as your captain, who can read 2 whole languages, yells at everyone to advance, something strange happens. You start to sing. No, not you exactly, more like your entire unit. In low, gravelly, tuneless voices. The kind of half-melodic grumbling that sounds like a tavern brawl got converted into sound waves. This is war music, medieval style. No drums. No trumpets. Just men yelling in rhythm to stop themselves from weeping. You might be chanting a simple line, Deus Vult, if you're crusading, or St. George in Merry England, if you're English, or possibly just, We're Not Dead Yet, in whatever dialect you were born yelling in. The goal is not to produce a beautiful harmony. It's to not pee yourself in terror. Because singing, yelling, chanting. It binds people together. It fills the silence between we might die and we're still here. And when no instruments can survive the mud, blood, and rain, the human voice is all you've got. And if you're really lucky, one of the soldiers, probably a bored night squire or a disillusioned bard who forgot to stay in the castle, knows a few verses of a chanson de geste. These are heroic ballads, mostly fictional, sung by people who've never won a war but are determined to die trying. You huddle by a fire. Someone mutters about Charlemagne. Someone else burps. The guy next to you starts coughing up a worrying amount of blood, but the mood is still somehow better than last Thursday. Because in war, music is a kind of magic, a spell that keeps your limbs moving when your brain wants to curl up and quit. But then the battle ends. Your side doesn't win, or doesn't lose. It's unclear. Either way, you're suddenly on the wrong side of a ransom, and you find yourself in a medieval prison, and not the kind with bunks and books. No. This is a literal hole in the ground. A dank, rat-haunted, urine-slicked dungeon that smells like every bad decision ever made. You've got a wall for a pillow and a bucket for a friend. Your crimes? Vaguely defined. Your sentence? Until someone remembers you're alive. But even here, somehow, there's music. Because people sing to stay sane. There are prison ballads, some whispered, some wailed, passed from cell to cell like bread crusts. Sad. Slow songs about lost loves, about betrayal, about the injustice of being stuck in a hole for stealing turnips. You might hear a melody echo from the next cell over, a scrap of a tune for home, sung by someone who barely remembers the words but remembers how it made their mother smile. And if you're a noble, you get parchment. You might even compose in prison, like a weird number of medieval poets did. There are documented songs written from jail by disgraced knights, unlucky barons, and one guy who just refused to pay his taxes. The melodies are lost, but the lyrics remain, full of longing, rage, and, occasionally, a weird amount of puns. One noble prisoner in 14th century France wrote an entire book of poetry while imprisoned in Tower. His name was Charles d'Orleans, and he rhymed his way through captivity like it was a group therapy session with a feather quill. Meanwhile, back in the lower-class dungeons, the musical stylings are less poetic. A lot of stomping. Some rhythmic coughing. Maybe a shanty, if someone remembers one. You might tap the wall with your fingernails to pass time. Or hum the last church hymn you heard before you were arrested for insulting a bishop's horse. The walls are made of stone. The straw is infested. But somehow, you manage to hum. Because music, even bad music, is a rebellion. Against silence, against despair. And if you ever get out, you might find yourself somewhere even worse. A plague town. You wake up to bells. Not church bells. Death bells. Each one signaling someone else has died, which is, statistically speaking, everyone. The streets are half empty. The other half are full of corpses. No one's making music now. Right? Wrong. Because human beings are chronically unable to shut up, even during an apocalypse. And so, in the midst of pestilence and decay, people are still singing. Processions of terrified citizens wander the streets, some praying, some flagellating themselves, some singing hymns of repentance in cracked voices, hoping that God will hear them and stop turning everyone's lungs into soup. There are songs about sin, songs about death, and weirdly upbeat songs that survive in manuscripts written in the margins with skull doodles and suspicious wine stains. The danse macabre, the dance of death, becomes a recurring theme. It shows up in art, in music, in poetry. The idea is that no matter who you are, peasant or king, you'll end up dancing with the Grim Reaper eventually. In Germany, there are plague songs with actual choreography. Because apparently, if you're going to die, you might as well die with flair. But the most chilling form of music during plague years? The silence between songs. That eerie quiet in a town that once had bells and now just has wind. Still, a voice will rise. Somewhere, someone will hum. It might be a lullaby. It might be a dirge. It might be the only way they remember their sister. Because in medieval life, where survival was a miracle and peace was suspicious, music was the most human thing you could do, especially when there were no instruments, no stage, no comfort. Just lungs. And the will to sing anyway. Now, you may be thinking, surely, after all this chaos, war, jail, plague, we finally get to a happier part of medieval life. Well, that depends on how you feel about dancing peasants, rhythmic sheep shearing, and one guy in a field trying to become a human bagpipe. Shall we? You wake up to the sound of silence, which is suspicious, because usually there's a rooster, or a crying baby, or someone vomiting into a bucket. But today, there's just calm. Too calm. You step outside your hut, if you can call a wattle and daub wall stuffed with a hut, and realize today is a feast day, or a saint's day, or a holy day of obligation, or possibly just a we survived another week without the river catching fire kind of day. Point is, you don't have to go to the fields today. You can dance. Now, dance in medieval terms doesn't mean coordinated routines and well-rehearsed choreography. No TikTok. No jazz hands. Just a vaguely synchronized series of hops, spins, and panic clapping, performed by people wearing 16 layers of wool and probably a belt made out of rope. You form a circle. Someone claps a rhythm. Another person joins in with a foot stomp. A third starts humming something that might have once been a folk tune before it got passed through 16 generations of tone-deaf relatives. And just like that, you've got music. No instruments. No choir. Just a combined enthusiasm of several underfed villagers who haven't seen a party since someone got married 3 summers ago, and everyone drank pond wine by mistake. You don't even realize it, but you've slipped into a kind of body percussion, clapping, stomping, slapping your thighs, even snapping or attempting to snap. Fingers were colder then. It's music made entirely with what little you have left, yourself. And it turns out, medieval people were really good at this. Because they had to be. In villages too poor to own a lute or even a single broken drum, you used whatever was available: feet, hands, walls, benches, the hollow thud of your own chest. Did you know there were shearing songs? That's right. There were actual musical traditions for singing while cutting the wool off of sheep. You'd hum a little tune to calm the animal and yourself, and try not to accidentally invent a meat pie by mistake. There were harvest songs, too, sung in time with the swing of a scythe. Not because it made the work easier, it didn't, but because it made the endless repetition feel like something more than soul erosion. Even tasks like churning butter or turning a grindstone were accompanied by low, muttered rhythms. People would slap the sides of barrels, chant in patterns, bang their tools against wooden beams. Everything became an excuse to make a beat. And here's the weird thing. Even when instruments were technically around, say, the noble's manor up the road had a harp or someone's cousin had a recorder, most people still chose to make music the cheap way. Why? Because communal music wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about surviving boredom, staving off despair, filling the long, miserable hours between frost and famine with something slightly more fun than arguing about whether or not geese have souls. There were nonsense songs, too. Pure rhythmic babble passed from parent to child, the medieval version of nursery rhymes. And they were often full of weird references, filthy double meanings, or jokes about clergy that could technically get you flogged. And then there's the dancing plague. Yes, that's not a joke. It actually happened. In 1518, yes, we've wandered slightly into the Renaissance here, but go with it. In Strasbourg, dozens of people started dancing in the street and couldn't stop. No music. No explanation, just twitching, stomping, rhythmic madness that spread like a yawn at a funeral. Some historians think it was mass hysteria. Others say it was poison bread. Personally, I think it was the ultimate medieval flash mob. But the point is, people needed to move, to make sound, to shake something loose, even if it was their own sanity. You'd think the clergy might frown on this kind of chaos. And they did. Mostly. Unless the songs were about saints, or performed in church, or done with just enough solemnity to trick God into thinking you weren't enjoying yourself. But out in the villages, the rules were looser, which meant music could be anything. A group of kids smacking spoons on their knees. A farmer whistling while burying a suspiciously shaped sack. An old woman muttering a melody to her bread dough so it doesn't rise angry. Everything became music. There were even vocal games, a kind of proto-beatboxing, where people would try to mimic animal sounds or create rhythmic nonsense just to make others laugh. It wasn't formal. It wasn't pretty. But it was theirs. And that's the heart of all this. For 3 hours now, We've wandered through monasteries, markets, battlefields, bedrooms, and dungeons. We've seen music as devotion, rebellion, coping mechanism, and occasionally just plain weirdness. But the truth is, medieval music didn't need instruments. Because medieval life was the instrument. Every sigh, every stomp, every chant, whistle, moan, and murmur, it all counted. You didn't wait for the harpist to arrive. You were the harp. And even if your voice cracked, your rhythm faltered, or you forgot the second verse, it didn't matter. Because in a world where death was a neighbor and survival was its own kind of art, the simple act of making sound, together, was the most human thing you could do. So if you're still awake, and, let's be honest, you shouldn't be, thank you for traveling through the strange, smelly, and strangely musical world of the Middle Ages. Whether you're listening at 2 a.m., with one earbud in, or drifting off with your mouth slightly open and drooling on your pillow, you've been a part of something special. Something old. Something weird. Something boring, but beautiful. And hey, if you've enjoyed this sleepy little stroll through history, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like it. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here to bore you into blissful unconsciousness. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see just how many insomniacs and gentle nerds are wandering the night with me. Now go. Sleep. And if you dream tonight, let it be of monks chanting softly, peasants clapping badly, and one nobleman composing terrible poetry in a very damp cell. Because music is everywhere, even when there's nothing playing.